When I, Lance Bryce Sorensen, was 19 years old, I was not wise in the affairs of life, and I desired regular sex more than I had the opportunity to achieve it. During my first year at Amherst College, I developed a crush on a visiting teacher. Her name was Elizabeth Hampton, and she had recently been hired as a faculty member at McGill University in Canada. Elizabeth was an expert in environmental science. I could not accurately determine her age, but I believed that she was about 40 years old. Although I was only a 19-year-old boy, I looked older. I preferred to think that I was mature than my age, and had always looked that way since I was 13. I was never asked for ID, even though I had a fake ID that said I was 26 years old, and no one ever asked questions. This and the fact that I took online environmental science courses the summers before and after high school, as well as during high school, allowed me to take a 300-level course taught by Elizabeth, namely Inst 310 Ecosystem Ecology. I wasn't the only man in Elizabeth's class impressed by her appearance. Her face was not beautiful, but pretty. Her brown hair with reddish tints was shiny. Her body was slender, except for her nicely rounded, tight butt, and her legs were long and slender, even for someone who was 5 feet 10 inches tall. Her voice was melodious, and she was intelligent with a well-developed sense of humor. 21 of the 22 students in the class seemed to like her, even though she was a strict but fair examiner. My first contact with Elizabeth outside of class occurred on an unusually cold fall day in Massachusetts around 5 o'clock in the evening. I was walking through the faculty parking lot on my way to the gym when I heard the starter grind and saw her get out of the car with an annoyed look on her face. I turned sharply towards her car, heading towards the gym. She had just taken her cell phone out of her purse when I came within range to call her. "Is there a problem, Mrs. Hampton?" I asked. "Oh, hi, Lance," she said, looking at me and easily recognizing me. "I'm 6'6", have golden brown hair and stubble, and I wasn't wearing a hat, although given the temperature I should have worn one. Yeah, my car won't start. It should have been used to the cold since I usually live in Montreal, but apparently today's unseasonably cold temperatures are too much for it. Do you mind if I take a look? My uncle owns a Ford dealership, and I worked for him for a few summers during high school." "You're welcome," she laughed. I opened her car door, lifted the hood, and looked under it. You don't have to be a master mechanic to see that there was too much corrosion on the battery terminals. "Do you have a wrench and a rag?" I asked. "I think my husband put an emergency tool kit in the trunk, and I'm sure there's a rag in there," she replied. I did find a small but sufficient set of tools in the trunk, but no rag. I used the adjustable wrench from the tool kit to disconnect the wires, scraping off some of the corrosion with a screwdriver, but there was still more that needed to be removed. I took the t-shirt out of my gym bag and used it to remove any remaining corrosion. Elizabeth saw what I was doing and was outraged. "Lance, you shouldn't ruin your clothes by helping me," she chided. "It's okay. It's an old shirt that needed to be washed after practice, so don't worry," I replied. While I was cleaning the terminals, I chatted with Elizabeth about where she lived in Canada, why she lived there as a US citizen, and just had a nice conversation. After about 5 minutes, I reattached the wires using a wrench and asked her to try starting the car. She started up immediately. Elizabeth was very grateful and wanted to pay me. "You're kidding," I laughed. "Your class is the best thing that's happened to me this week," I said honestly, trying not to mention that it was both because of the subject matter and because of her appearance. "So I'm happy to help. However, I would appreciate a ride to the gym, which was on the other side of campus, and I was freezing standing in the cold, if you don't mind." "Sit down," she said. While we were talking, while she was driving about a mile and a half along the road, it was much shorter on foot, her skirt and coat rode up. I tried not to look at her thighs. It was almost impossible because they looked more like aesthetic, artistic objects than body parts. My second contact with Elizabeth outside of class came when I came to her office hours about a major project we needed to write for the course. I wanted to write about the resilience of ecosystems in wetlands near power plants, something I had not seen in the literature. She showed enthusiasm for the topic and gave me several resources I could use, but also recommended that I contact plant operators and government environmental officials in at least a half-dozen locations where wetlands and power plants are in close proximity. She also suggested comparing these places to swamps near wind turbines and solar fields. The 40-minute academic discussion in her office was stimulating. Her desk had no modesty screen, and she was wearing a relatively short skirt, and if I turned my head a certain way, I could see her blue panties. The third out-of-class contact with Elizabeth was on Thanksgiving Day. The three girls from ENST 310, and I lived too far away to easily get home for the American Thanksgiving, which Elizabeth celebrated, not the Canadian one. After the last class before Thanksgiving, she asked if anyone would stay on campus for the holiday, which can be a lonely time when almost everyone is away. The three girls and I raised our hands, and she asked us to stay after class. After the lesson, she asked the four of us if we had any plans, and when the three girls said no, even though I had plans, I would rather spend the day with Elizabeth, so I said no too. She invited us to her apartment on Thanksgiving morning, and I immediately canceled my original plans. You'd think the girl guests would ask, "What should I bring?" But apparently these three weren't your typical girls, because they didn't. However, after they left, I asked about it. Elizabeth was very pleased. At first she refused, but when I offered a bottle of wine and asked what she liked, and the famous sweet potato dish from the local deli, she agreed with a smile. I arrived at Elizabeth's apartment early because I didn't want the girls to see that I had brought 2 bottles of Elizabeth's favorite wine and a sweet potato dish and helped her get settled. She seemed grateful for my enthusiastic help. Elizabeth did a good job preparing the small turkey, stuffing, and green beans, and everyone enjoyed the meal. The girls ran away after dinner, and I stayed behind to help with the cleanup. Elizabeth surprised me by asking if I wanted to stay and watch the football after we finished cleaning. I was surprised that she was a football fan. I hid my enthusiasm when I agreed. While we were watching the game, another case of serendipity occurred, depending on your point of view, when she drank most of the bottle of wine I brought. I don't drink, but pretended to drink wine with her, sat down where I could well examine her legs and cleavage, and sympathized with her when she complained about being away from her husband, daughter, and son. Apparently, Elizabeth was very relaxed around me, because about halfway through the game, I saw her fall asleep in the comfortable chair she was sitting in. I didn't mean to be a pervert, but I was when I walked up to her and got a great look at her gorgeous body. I turned off the TV, dimmed the lights, carried her empty glass and almost empty bottle of wine into the kitchen, took a blanket from another piece of furniture in her living room and covered her. Then I quietly left her apartment. Elizabeth called me the next day, obviously very embarrassed. I was as kind as I could, telling her not to think about it, and that it wasn't surprising that she dozed off considering how hard she was working on the food. After we sorted that out, she continued, "One thing I wanted to ask you before I fell asleep so rudely last night, Lance, was if you could help me set up an out-of-lab demonstration tomorrow for what I'll be doing in class next week." "Of course, I don't have anything on my agenda tomorrow," I replied cheerfully. It was a lie, but I was ready to give up my plans to be with Elizabeth again. We worked on a Saturday from about 8 a.m. until about 4 p.m., conducting an experiment in a wetland about 20 miles from campus. After that, we stopped for some fast food. Around 5:30 p.m., when it was almost dark, I helped her carry some things from the car to the apartment. After staring at Elizabeth for most of the day, when I walked into her apartment, I lost control. She was disheveled, dirty, and sexy as hell. Looking at her, I said, "Nothing to do with studying. You are the sexiest woman I have ever seen." After a significant pause, looking into my soul, she replied, "That's completely inappropriate, Lance. This is also worrying. I didn't want my complaints about missing my husband to give you lustful ideas." "Sorry, Mrs. Hampton, but I'm a normal young guy, and it's becoming impossible to ignore your sexuality," I growled as I approached her. When I came face to face with her, still looking into my soul, she quietly said, "You need a cold shower." After another pregnant pause, I answered, No, I need you. With these words, I kissed her. I broke the kiss and she said, an instructor can't have sex with a student. Then I'll skip class, I replied and kissed her again. The next time, she said, please stop, Lance. I'm not strong enough, physically, emotionally, or mentally, to stop you. I can't stop, you're amazing, I replied and kissed her again. Not a word was spoken for about the next half hour. We made love. It took both of us at least 20 to 30 minutes to come to our senses. When we did this, I looked Elizabeth in the eyes and said, thank you, this was the best experience of my life. I feel so guilty, she said, and her lips began to tremble. There's nothing to feel guilty about. I have defeated you. I didn't give you a choice. I would say I'm very sorry, but I'm really not, because again, it was the best experience of my life. Elizabeth half smiled. Now we're dirty and sweaty, let's take a shower, I said with a smile. Elizabeth protested softly as I picked her up and carried her into the master bathroom of her apartment. I wanted her to protest gently so that I could continue to blame myself and assuage her guilt, because I had every intention of using this night for a relationship until she returned to Canada. When I hugged her, she said, I could use a nap, and put her head on the pillow. I wanted to kiss her. Please leave me alone, Lance, she said quietly. My answer was in her ear. I'll do it after one more time, I lied. Elizabeth and I woke up almost simultaneously in the middle of the night about 2 a.m. In fact, I'm hungry, a sentence she said, turning to me and looking at me intently. In the light of the street lamp, we could see a little of each other. When I smiled, she said, not for another round of sex, animal. This unsatisfactory fast food meal was a few hours ago. Let's at least eat some cereal or oatmeal. Only if we eat naked and go back to bed, I smiled. Bastard, she laughed, quickly jumping out of bed before I could grab her. We ate oatmeal and chatted about various things, as if a college professor wasn't having sex with her student. After I rinsed the bowls and put them in the dishwasher, I took her hands, stepped back to arm's length, and examined her. You know you're hotter than any co-ed at Amherst, don't you, Mrs. Hampton? She blushed, paused, and then replied, you need to get your eyes checked. Now that my hunger for food has been satisfied, I have another need to satisfy, I chuckled. You really are an animal, she replied as I picked her up again and carried her to bed. After breakfast on Sunday morning, while my clothes were first washed and then dried in her dryer, and she was wearing a short robe, I said, Mrs. Hampton, we need to talk. She never asked me to call her Elizabeth, so I continued to call her Mrs. Hampton, which was much racier. We still had 4 days before school resumed since Amherst had a long Thanksgiving break, and I thought of something that would be helpful for her. Yes, we need to, Lance. I don't think we can continue, she started to say before I interrupted her. I need to continue. You are the highlight of my life, and I know that you truly enjoyed yesterday and this morning. What I want to talk about is how we can continue without hurting you. She perked up at this. You know that after classes end in mid-December, I'm moving back to Canada. I'm not teaching at Amherst next semester. Especially since you need to enjoy each other's company, now provided that it does not harm you, I smiled. I was confident that we could keep our relationship a secret if we didn't show affection in public and were careful in everything we did outside of her apartment. Since I lived alone in the dorm, no one would notice my absence. What I was most concerned about was that she was able to objectively distance herself from me to evaluate my performance, as I did not want any preference to turn against her. She appreciated it when I mentioned it and smiled when I said, I have a solution. All attention, she smiled, and then indecently showed her body. You're terrible, I chuckled, and then continued. I know that you have a good relationship with Professor Sylvia Compton, and that you did her a great service by filling in for her when she had to leave for 2 weeks for family reasons. You should tell her that you have one student, me, who has helped you on several projects and you don't want to show preference, and one student, Bill Thornton, who you hate and don't want to penalize with a grade because of it. You ask her to grade our coursework and exam essays and give her examples of A, B, and C level work from other students. So she is on the same page as you. You don't tell her that I'm your favorite and Bill is your enemy. You call Bill and me into your office and tell us what you're doing. Then everyone should be happy. I knew that Elizabeth hated Thornton because his comments in class indicated that he would rather destroy the environment than protect it, making everyone wonder why he took ENS 310 in the first place. After thinking about it for about 30 seconds, she said, "This is a brilliant idea," and sat on my lap. She shouldn't have done this because it led to us making love again. After we finished, I took my dried clothes out of the dryer. We agreed that I would come over for dinner around 6:30 in the evening and then stay the night, and I left after kissing her passionately. With the exception of one night when Elizabeth had to host a couple of teachers in her apartment. From that Sunday until she went home, I spent every night with her. In my opinion, and I think she would have to agree, we no longer had sex, but made love at least twice a day. The evaluation procedure I proposed worked very well. I was quite happy with the grade I received in ENS 310, and Elizabeth felt good knowing that she showed no preference. On our last night together, we both actually cried. I cried only because at that moment I loved her, and my sexual relationship with her was so superior to any other in my life, or that I could imagine that I was sure that my sex life would go downhill. Elizabeth cried for several reasons. One of them, I honestly believe it was true, was that she thought our sexual relationship was as meaningful as I did, and although she didn't say it, there was some amount of love there. Her other reasons were guilt over cheating on her husband and, in her opinion, also on her children, and because she was ambivalent about returning to them. We had our last kiss in her apartment. I carried her suitcases to her car. We didn't touch each other anymore, and she drove away. I went back to my room to pack my things and leave the next day to visit my parents before the next semester starts in February, skipping the January session. Elizabeth and I did not exchange cell phone numbers, email addresses, or any other means to keep in touch. She asked me not to try to contact her, and I was going to respect her wishes. I knew that no matter how much I enjoyed our relationship, it could not last, much less be permanent. I was depressed for about 10 days before I finally came out of it using intense exercise. A year after I graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in environmental engineering, I transferred from Amherst after my sophomore year because they didn't have an environmental engineering major, and I was still feeling melancholy about not having Elizabeth. At the time of the transfer, I also changed what I was called. I wanted to make a complete break with my past with Elizabeth, so I started using my middle name, Bryce, instead of Lance. As Bryce, I was working in Washington State as an environmental engineer when I met Bella Morton. Bella was my age and a real beauty. There was something very intriguing about her that I couldn't quite put my finger on, but something about her was exciting. In addition to being an intriguing feature, Bella was smart, funny, beautiful, and sexy as hell. I especially liked her slender buttocks and legs, which seemed carved from Michelangelo's marble. They were so perfect. Her eyes were like green laser beams that could see right through you, and she was tall, about 5'11", which was always important to me since I'm 6'6". Bella was an ecologist, not an engineer, but this is a related profession. I met her when her company and mine were working on the same project, monitoring and restoring the largest wetland in the state. I can't say it was love at first sight, but something close. I was told by unreliable sources that she was a master at playing hard to get, but I was very motivated. I wasn't against a serious relationship with the right person, and I hoped that she wouldn't mind either. Working together, dinners with other colleagues, impromptu parties when certain project milestones were reached, and a few field trips, more for work than pleasure, were the only interactions we had during the first 6 months of dating. Next was a trip to the Paradise Wetlands of Mount Rainier National Park to conduct a comparative assessment of the wetlands we were working on. Before the trip, I tried to get Bella selected from her company to accompany me since the assessment needed people with our different skills. I was told that my company has no influence over who her company appoints. This meant I had a 67% chance of getting mediocre or idiotic. Her company's environmental team included a 60-year-old mediocre guy, a 42-year-old idiot, and a 24-year-old goddess. I'm lucky. When I arrived at the meeting place in the company Jeep, Bella was there. She smiled widely. I realized that she preferred to go with me rather than with 3 other engineers from my company working on the project. During the roughly 3-hour drive to the paradise wetlands of Mount Rainier National Park, we got along great. She was as interesting as she was beautiful and intriguing. I was probably the most charming person in my life. While we got to know each other better, we also talked about work for about an hour to make sure we were on the same page. I was glad that we had the same views on both work and personal life. Although the part of the swamp we wanted to survey and test was difficult to access, everything went smoothly. We worked like a well-coordinated mechanism. When we finished work for the day, we drove to the motel where our companies had booked 2 rooms. The rural motel turned out to be almost a wreck, which greatly upset both of us. We went to a decent restaurant for dinner, walked along a short scenic path to digest our food, and then returned to our rooms, which were next to each other. I really wanted to rip Bella's clothes off and drag her into my room, but I remained a gentleman. It was still quite early, so I turned on the ancient tube television in my room. It worked fine, and I found an interesting program about nature. I had only been watching for about 15 minutes when there was a knock on the door. When I opened it, I was pleased to see the sexiest young woman I knew. "Hey Bella, what's wrong?" I greeted her. "I forgot my book, and the ancient TV in my room shows only snow static. Is your TV working?" "It's working, come in." Bella sat down next to me on the old but comfortable sofa. I asked if she was happy with the nature program, and she was more than pleased. I grabbed a couple of cans of soda from the ancient, noisy mini fridge in the room, and we drank them while we watched and talked. Bella was wearing shorts that showed off her long, slender, tanned legs, and a top that appeared to have no underwear underneath. I think I was too obvious in my adoration. I really tried to be subtle, but her body was so hot she could have been a TV weatherman, so I guess I was too obvious. I knew this because after about 20 minutes of talking, drinking soda, and partially watching the program, she stared me in the eye with her green laser beams in a playful manner and said with a devilish smile, "No, I'm not wearing underwear." At first I was confused and probably blushed, but when she kept looking at me with those laser eyes, I said to myself, why not go ahead and see where it leads? After a pause that must have lasted a full 60 seconds since I asked myself this question, I said, "I guess I should apologize for staring at you, but I'm not going to." Then I said out loud what I had previously said to myself. "Your body is so hot you should be a TV meteorologist." "Is that your favorite phrase?" She laughed. "Never used it before. Now I need to check how well it works," I growled. We had sex. We lay nose to nose on the blanket with contented smiles. She spoke first. "If I had known you were such a beast, I would have seduced you sooner." "You did not seduce me, Bella Bella. I conquered you. Aren't you ashamed that you didn't drag me into your network earlier? We could have been enjoying each other's carnal pleasures for the last couple of months if you weren't such a Boy Scout." After we extended our work trip by one night and spent it in a nice hotel, we were left in no doubt about what we wanted. It was the first relationship in my life that felt completely and utterly right. She expressed the same feeling. Within 10 days of our trip, we were living together in her apartment and enjoying life to the fullest. Somehow, maybe we both should have become actors. We hid our relationship from our colleagues. We also hid all details, including names from both parents, because they interfered too much with the past. We told our siblings that we were in a relationship, me with Bella, her with Bryce, and it eventually came to our parents, but without details. When our company's joint project ended successfully, we both received a bonus. She got $100 more than me, which led to a lot of humorous arguments and a week of vacation because we finished ahead of schedule. We went to Hawaii together, promising ourselves that we wouldn't spend more than 8 hours a day in our room. It was a difficult promise, but we kept it for 6 of the 7 days we were there. On our last day in Hawaii, at sunset on a remote, picturesque beach, we intertwined our hands and looked into each other's eyes. "I know what you're thinking," Bella whispered. I know what your answer will be, I replied. Even though it's not a secret, we should do it the classic way, she giggled. I smiled, got down on one knee, and asked a question. She pretended to think about how to respond until I started tickling her. Okay, bastard, yes, I will, she laughed. I stood up, kissed her, and carried her to the rental car. Although we had made love many times before, that night it was a loving merging of souls, and we fell asleep as if on a calm sea. When we returned to Washington, we bought matching, simple wedding rings and began planning our future. Since my parents now lived in Northern Virginia and her mother and stepfather had recently moved to the Washington, D.C. suburbs in Maryland, we decided that we would both look for work in the area. Because we both studied well and had positive work experiences in Washington state, we both found great jobs within 3 months. We both lived pretty Spartan lives, so we didn't have to pack much. We sent things to my parents because they had more space. I sold my car with the intention of buying another when we arrived in the Washington, D.C. area and took turns driving Bella's car the 2,400 miles or so to my parents' house. At the start of our road trip, we had only been intimate for about 6 months and talked surprisingly little about our families. I knew her parents' names were Roger and Liz, and her brothers' names were Alex, and she knew the names of my parents, sister, and brother, but we hadn't even seen pictures of each other's families and knew few details. I knew that her stepfather Roger was in some kind of financial business, and her mother Liz worked in environmental consulting, and that her brother Alex had just graduated from Brown University, but nothing else. We were somewhere in Iowa when a very interesting incident happened. Bella was talking to her mom on her cell phone while I was driving, and she said with a laugh, "I assure you, Mom, we'll be at the Hamptons' house in a week, so don't freak out." I wasn't sure I heard correctly. When she ended the call after about 5 minutes, I asked Bella, "Are your parents in the Hamptons now? I thought they were in Potomac, Maryland." "What?" she said, puzzled. "I didn't say they were in the Hamptons." "I'm sure I heard the word Hampton," I countered. "Yeah, I said we'd be at their house, the Hamptons' house," she laughed. "But your last name is Morton, not Hampton," I blurted out. "Didn't I tell you that my last name at birth was Morton, but after my father died and my mother remarried, she took Roger's last name, Hampton. Alex and I didn't change our last name out of respect for our father, so we still have the last name Morton. It caused problems at school, but Alex and I didn't care about it, and Roger and Mom never insisted. Roger is a good man, and he understood," she replied. Suddenly my skin felt clammy, my armpits were sweaty, and my stomach was churning. As unobtrusively as I could, I asked, "Is your mother's name Elizabeth Hampton?" "Yes, but everyone in the family calls her Liz. She only uses Elizabeth professionally." "Did she work somewhere else besides environmental consulting?" "Yes, sure. When Alex and I were little, she didn't even use her environmental science degree and just sold real estate. After her father's death, she worked in various fields of environmental consulting, and when she married Roger, she began teaching at the college level. When we moved to Canada for Roger's job, when I was a senior and a freshman at Berkeley, she taught at McGill for a while, and when they returned to the States, she went back into environmental consulting. After I swallowed hard, I continued, "Did she teach anywhere other than McGill?" Bella paused and thought. "I don't think. Oh, wait, yeah, the first semester of my freshman year at Berkeley, she was a visiting professor at Amherst College in Massachusetts. It was only one semester." "Oh, she has a really interesting work history," I gulped, feeling very unwell, and since there was a rest stop 2 miles away, I said to Bella, "I need to go to the bathroom right away. Do you mind if we stop at the next parking lot?" "No, my bladder is like a nut," Bella giggled. "I barely made it to the parking lot toilet before I threw up. Luckily, I haven't eaten in a while, so it wasn't too hard to clean up." I looked in the mirror to compose myself before getting back into the car. "Why do you look green?" Bella asked. "It seems like something didn't like my stomach," I replied with a fake smile. "Can you steer a little?" I pretended to be asleep, thinking about what had happened. I was grateful that I learned that Bella's mother was my first love before I saw her again, and when we stopped for the night while Bella was in the shower, I used her phone to send her mom an upbeat message that ended with the words, "Oh, by the way, if you need this information for the future, Bryce's full name is Lance Bryce Sorensen, his sister Carla, his brother Jack, his father Hank, and his mother Ruth." I needed to warn Elizabeth, just as I was given this warning, so that she could be prepared. The next morning, I seemed normal to Bella, and we made it to my parents' house around 9 p.m. As I expected, in the 3 days we spent with my family, they fell in love with Bella. In fact, I was worried that they might keep Bella and kick me out if we ever broke up. I prayed that the situation with Elizabeth would never surface, that there would be no separation, but if it did, I knew all bets would be off. We arrived at the beautiful Hamptons home in trendy Potomac, Maryland, around lunchtime on the day we moved out of my parents' house. It was only a 40-minute journey. I was prepared not to show any reaction when I saw Elizabeth. Obviously, she was also prepared, because I don't think anyone noticed any unusual reaction when we quickly hugged when we met. I did, hopefully subtly, but perhaps not, look closely at Elizabeth. Although her face looked a little older, if anything, her body was slimmer than I remembered 5 years ago. My impression was confirmed when, in our initial conversations, Bella said, "Mom, you look great. Are you doing more sports?" In a response that I believe was phrased largely for my benefit, Elizabeth said, "Well, I'm 45 now, honey, so I should be staving off old age by working out intensely 6 days a week." Her body looked 25, not 45, but I remained silent. "Well, you really look good, Mom," Bella rejoiced. "Would you say she was 45 if you saw her on the street, Bryce?" Bella asked. "She looks at least 10 years younger," I replied quietly but sincerely. "Thank you, Bryce. That's kind of you, even if it means your eyesight is bad," Elizabeth chuckled. Now that I've seen Elizabeth and Bella side by side, I understand why my first reaction to Bella was, "She's intriguing." Although Elizabeth and Bella didn't look much alike, they had, for lack of a better word, an aura that was strikingly similar. Although the first 5 minutes in the presence of both mother and daughter went fine, my mind began to become very confused as events unfolded because I had to carefully watch what I said. Also, and this became increasingly disturbing as time went on, my old feelings for Elizabeth began to resurface in my consciousness. I thought that when I started dating Bella, I had completely forgotten Elizabeth, but now that I was in her presence, it became clear that she had not been banished from my subconscious. There was a lot to do in the 3 days we spent at Bella's parents' house. I bought a used car. Bella and I brought some of our stuff to our rented apartment in Arlington, Virginia, near both of my parents' homes, and arranged for furniture to be delivered. Because I had saved up significantly more money than Bella, and because I had a better-paying job, except for that last bonus, and was better with money, I paid all the initial moving expenses. This wasn't a problem for me since we planned to get married in a simple ceremony in 3 months, using the Hamptons house as the reception venue. The day we left the Hamptons house for our apartment, before we left, Elizabeth discreetly passed me a note, which I put in my pocket without reading. After we had unpacked some of the things in the apartment and Bella was checking out nearby stores, I read the note. "Please meet me at Starbucks in Tyson's Mall at 1 p.m. today. Important. Call my number if you have any problems. Do not write." I knew we needed to meet to discuss our stories and figure out how I, and maybe she too, could suppress the old feelings that were starting to surface. I met Elizabeth at Starbucks in Tyson's at 1 p.m. We exchanged a formal hug. Elizabeth was clearly nervous, and so was I. She got straight to the point. "Lance, or should I now say Bryce, I'm shocked that we're in this situation. The odds must be 1 in 50 million. I agree, but with even better odds, someone wins the big lottery almost every month. We just need to figure out how to deal with it." At that moment, her mobile phone rang. "It's Bella," she moaned. "I really have to answer, just be quiet." I nodded in agreement. Elizabeth, I think I should call her Liz now, was nervous as she answered the phone. She almost dropped it and tried to answer several times before she succeeded. "Hey, honey, what's wrong?" From what I heard, it was a fairly normal conversation, although Liz was clearly lying about where she was and what she was doing. After a couple of minutes, she put the phone on the table, her hands still shaking. "I hate lying to Bella," Liz sobbed. "This situation is causing me great suffering." "I know, me too," I said in a voice that I hoped sounded stronger and more confident than I felt, placing my hands on hers to stop them from shaking. "You know how hard it was for me to leave you 5 years ago," she said, slightly out of breath. "It was the best sex of my life, and although our affair only lasted a couple of weeks, I began to fall in love with you." "I fell in love with you," I replied, again hoping that my voice sounded strong and confident. "I thought about you almost every day until I started dating Bella. But we need to be strong. Now, 5 years later, is not the time to hurt Roger, Bella, and possibly many other people." Liz sighed and said, "Of course I understand, Lance. I mean Bryce. So I wanted to meet today so we could agree on our story about how we never met in Amherst and how to proceed if anyone ever inquires. Amherst will never release your documents, so no one will know that I was your teacher, and I hope you don't have a copy of the document." "Good point," I replied. "I may have a copy of the document in the safe in the apartment. I'll look right away when I get home, and if it's there, I'll destroy it. I definitely don't need her to get another job." "With time, will it become easier for you not to show any feelings towards me?" she asked. "It will be difficult at first, but I am sure we will both get through it. One condition: we should never be alone and should never, under any circumstances, discuss our past even if no one is around." "Agreed," I said and asked. With a sigh, Liz replied, "Yes, absolutely. After today, we'll never be alone again, and while we'll probably have to make up excuses as we go, I've already written down a few of them." With that, she took the document out of her purse, receiving a puzzled look when she looked at her phone and tapped the phone again a few times. "What's happened?" I asked. "Oh, my screen has been a little unruly lately, but I don't think it's a problem," she replied, beginning to explain that she had written to avoid any possible problems in the future. This turned out to be the worst prediction of my life. I knew it was going to be a storm as soon as I walked into our new apartment. Bella had red eyes, still full of tears, and was holding a 3-page document. "What's wrong, honey?" I muttered as I approached her with open arms, hoping to hug her. "Don't touch me, you perverted bastard," she screamed, pushing me away with a force worthy of any ball-carrying runner. "How could you have sex with my mom, a woman you knew was married with a family, a bastard? How can I trust you in the future if you have so little respect for the institution of marriage?" Apparently, the windbreak happened because when Liz was nervous and put her phone on the table at Starbucks, she accidentally left it unplugged, and when Bella almost did, she heard Liz's first words to me. Curious and wondering if her mother was still talking to her, Bella didn't end the call. Hearing my voice, she put the phone to her ear. She heard our conversation until Liz hung up, taking the documents out of her purse, leaving nothing to the imagination. The document in Bella's hands was my Amherst document, which she apparently took from the safe after hearing that it might be there. The document clearly showed that I received a grade of a in ENST 310 Ecosystem Ecology, taught by Instructor E. Hampton. I could spend thousands of words talking about the next 2 weeks as Liz, and I tried to convince my fiancée and her husband not to end our relationship. But I will not retell this time because it was the most painful thing in my life. Not only did this end my relationship with Bella and Liz's relationship with Roger, but my parents were also hurt and clearly on Bella's side, and they made that clear to both her and me, as did Bella's brother Alex. Luckily, my sister took it in stride, and thankfully, but also alarmingly, was my little brother's reaction. "Wow, how did you manage to sleep with a hot mommy dude?" Both Liz and I tried to sacrifice ourselves for another person. None of our actions were more effective than all the arguments we made to obtain forgiveness. The resentment and pain were too deep, even 5 years later. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning, I struggled to get out of bed in the apartment in which I now lived alone. I was depressed and felt terrible. I hoped that I would have enough strength to exercise, but I realized that it was all I had to do to get through my first week at my new job. As I sat mindlessly eating a bowl of cold cereal, my cell phone rang. The screen showed that the caller was probably the only person in the world I was willing to talk to at 10:11 m on Saturday. "Hi, Liz," I replied. "Hi, Bryce," she replied. I was nearby, looking for an apartment, and suddenly felt the need for human contact. Since you're probably the only person in the world who would listen to me with sympathy, I hope you'll let me come in and chat. "I need human contact too," I sighed. "When can you be here?" "According to GPS, I'm about 10 minutes away. This is fine." "See you in 10 minutes," I replied and ended the call. I poured out the rest of my cereal, took a quick shower, shaved, and put on casual clothes. Almost exactly 11 minutes after I ended the call, the doorbell rang. Liz stood there, looking just as depressed as I was. I invited her in, and we hugged for a good minute. When I said she looked depressed, I meant sad, not unattractive. In fact, she was very attractive. We talked about small things for a while, sitting on my only sofa. Then she started crying. "I'm sorry I ruined your life, Lance," she sobbed. "I should call you Lance, not this Bryce," she said through tears. I pulled her close, and she cried on my shoulder for a couple of minutes. "You are just as attractive to me now as you were when I seduced you 2 days after Thanksgiving over 5 years ago," I replied, staring into her piercing aquamarine eyes. We looked at each other without blinking for what seemed like 10 minutes before I stroked her face. "You know we can still be together," I said quietly. She threw herself into my arms, and we exchanged a kiss. We didn't have sex, we made love. This time we both realized it, and no one tried to deny it. I said, looking into her eyes, "Please don't look for an apartment, Elizabeth. Stay here with me. I need you, and I think you need me too. And I really love you, you know." Elizabeth stared into my soul for another full minute before she spoke. "I really need you, and I really love you. You have to find a replacement for Bella, not the old witch from your past, but I'm selfish enough to agree to stay with you for now." Then we both smiled. The day Elizabeth and I reconnected was 18 months ago. My parents have finally come to terms with it, although they are worried that Elizabeth and I live in the same apartment and sleep in the same bed. Elizabeth has again established a good relationship with Alex and a less than close but acceptable relationship with Bella, although this is only possible if I am not around. Of course, given our 21-year age difference, the chances of us staying together forever are slim. She encourages me to seek a relationship with a woman my age, but at the moment I have no desire to do so. I'm in love with her, and our sexual relationship is unparalleled. That's all that matters to me at the moment. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next